저도 불과 몇 년 전까지는 키토제닉 식단이 딴 세상 이야기처럼 느껴졌습니다. 단지 극단적이고 보통 사람들은 실천이 불가능한 방식이라고 생각했습니다. 지금 돌이켜보면 그런 생각을 했던 이유는 100% 완성된 키토 식단만을 보았고 단계별 발전 과정은 전혀 몰랐기 때문이었던 것 같습니다. 이 식단에 도전하려면 기존의 식생활과 크게 달라져야 합니다. 그런 만큼 하루아침에 모든 걸 바꾸는 것이 아니라 점진적인 접근이 필요합니다. 그래서 이 분야의 전문가들은 사람들에게 저탄수화물 식단의 다양한 접근법을 제시하고 있습니다. 영양사 에이미 버거는 다이어트 닥터라는 유튜브 채널에 출연하여 키토를 시작하는 초심자들이 가장 집중해야 할 요소에 대해 이야기를 나누었습니다.
Amy has a master's in human nutrition and she's a certified nutrition specialist. And she came to low carb on her own first and then became certified in nutrition. And she has a wonderful way of explaining things and ways to make it easy and ways to make it that we can all understand. Her YouTube series is Keto Without the Crazy, and I think that really summarizes a lot of her message, that we don't have to get so caught up in things. We can make this more simple and still be effective. She also wrote the Alzheimer's Antidote, talking about Alzheimer's as sort of type 3 diabetes, as a glucose and insulin issue that can be addressed with low carb. So we talk about that. We talk about weight loss. We talk about a lot of the psychological sides of things, because it's not just about what you eat. It's also about who you are, how you approach this, what your mindset is, what your background is, and we have to factor those in. And I really appreciate Amy's attention to this. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Amy Berger. So you have been quite prolific in this field. But you're no stranger to it. You're no newbie to it. You started in the low-carb journey over 15 years ago, it sounds like. So tell us a little bit about what got you involved in low-carb.
Right. Well, like so many people, I came into low-carb because I was heavier and I wanted to lose weight. And I had kind of been on the heavy side my whole life. I wasn't, obese, but I was heavy. And I was especially heavy compared to the amount of exercise I was doing and what I thought was following a healthy diet.
Right.
I've actually completed 2 marathons, and, I was dutifully eating my whole grain bread with my light margarine and putting skim milk on my whole grain cereal. And no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many hours I exercised, the weight would not budge. And I'm fortunate in that I didn't have any major health issues, well, that I knew of anyway. All I really had was some excess weight. But there's, I have a family history of type 2 diabetes, cancer, stroke, and obesity. So the deck was kind of stacked against me. And I have no doubt that if I hadn't found low carb when I did, right now I'd probably have morbid obesity. I'd probably have PCOS. I might have type 2 diabetes. So it was my senior year of college, actually, that I read the Atkins book. That's how I got started. My mother got a copy of it at a yard sale. And she never read it, but I did. And it was so different. But I said, I've tried so many other things and nothing is working. Like, what do I have to lose? I'll try this. And it made sense, too. Like the way that Dr. Atkins wrote it, it made sense to me why this should work.
Right.
And maybe because I was so young, I wasn't really concerned about, what about my heart health? What about this? It was like, I just want to lose weight. I'm so desperate. I'll do anything.
여기서 그녀가 언급한 애킨스 다이어트 혁명의 저자인 애킨스 박사는 저탄고지 식단의 선구자로 현대의 저탄수화물 식단에 지대한 영향을 미친 인물입니다. 이 책과 애킨스 박사에 대해서는 뒤에서도 계속 언급이 될 예정이라 잠깐 이야기를 하고 넘어가겠습니다. 애킨스 박사는 1972년 이 책을 출간하면서 탄수화물 섭취를 엄격히 제한하는 것이 체중 관리와 건강 개선에 효과적이라는 주장을 펼쳤습니다. 당시로서는 혁신적인 접근이었고 이후 많은 저탄수화물 식단이 애킨스 박사의 이론을 바탕으로 발전해 왔습니다. 그러나 애킨스 박사는 존경보다는 비판과 공격의 대상이 되는 경우가 더 많습니다. 키토제닉 식단을 비판하는 사람들은 이 식단이 건강에 위험하다고 주장하면서 그가 심장마비로 사망했다는 점을 근거로 제시하곤 합니다. 저희 채널에서도 이에 대한 댓글이 달린 적이 있는데요. 그것은 사실과는 다른 완전히 잘못된 주장입니다. 애킨스 박사가 심장 건강에 문제가 있었던 것은 사실이지만 그것은 바이러스 감염으로 인한 심근병증이 원인이었습니다. 또한 그의 사망 원인은 심장마비가 아니라 겨울철 빙판길에서 넘어져서 입은 두부 손상과 그로 인한 합병증이었습니다. 애킨스 박사는 이 사고로 혼수 상태에 빠졌고 끝내 회복하지 못한 채 생을 마감하게 되었습니다. 이렇듯 그의 건강 문제와 사망은 그가 창시한 식단과 직접적인 연관이 없으며 실제로 그는 이 식이요법을 통해 체중과 대사 건강을 잘 관리했다고 알려져 있습니다. 또한 애킨스 다이어트와 맥을 같이 하는 저탄수화물 식이요법은 최근 들어 큰 주목을 받고 있으며 이 식단을 통해 체중을 효과적으로 관리하고 건강이 회복되는 사례들이 늘어나고 있습니다. 50년이 지난 지금도 여전히 그에 져서 애킨스 다이어트 혁명은 가치 있는 참고자료로 남아있으며 저탄수화물 식단을 이해하는데 좋은 기초 기초 입문서라고 할 수 있습니다. 영상의 주인공 에이미 버거 역시 이 인터뷰를 하며 애킨스 다이어트에 대해 자주 언급하고 있고 그녀가 제시하는 식단은 애킨스 다이어트와 일맥상통하는 부분이 많습니다. 최근 국내에서도 새롭게 번역 출간되었으니 이 책에 대해 관심 있는 분들께서는 영상 댓글에 링크를 확인해주세요.
And of course it worked. And I have no problem admitting it didn't stick the first time. I was maybe too young. I wasn't really ready to make it my life and the way that I was going to eat for the rest of my life. So I stopped and started a number of times. But it was only a few years after that that I stuck with it for the long term. And that's how I got into it. And I'm a career changer, so to speak. I wasn't always a nutritionist. You know, after being in and out of a lot of jobs that I didn't enjoy and I wasn't fulfilled by, I said, you know, I love low carb. I love learning about it. I love eating this way. I love cooking this way. Like, nutritionist is a job. Maybe I could do that. I could help other people with this. So I went back for formal, education in nutrition, and now here I am.
So that's what's so fascinating, though, is you were low carb first and then went to your formal education about nutrition, which was probably anti-low carb and all count your calories, all low fat. So when you were going through your training, what was that like for you? Was it sort of like, oh, maybe I'm wrong and they're right? Or was it, I just need to sort of ignore what they're saying and get through this because I know what works? What was your mindset there?
That's a good question. I actually chose the program I chose because I knew it wouldn't quite be 100% mainstream. I went to a university that has one of the 5 accredited naturopathic medical colleges, universities in the U.S., and it was, I went to the nutrition school, but just the fact that they had a naturopathic medical presence there told me, maybe they'll be open to something a little different. And I think it worked to my advantage. So they were not mainstream. They certainly weren't teaching keto. They weren't teaching low carb. They weren't teaching paleo, but the professors were very, very aware that most people were eating too much carbohydrate. Most people were eating especially too much refined sugar. Most of them were kind of on board with, saturated fat probably isn't that bad for you. But for me, I felt like, for me personally anyway, I had an advantage going to school for nutrition after learning a lot about it on my own because I was able to learn the biochem and the anatomy and physiology in the context of low carb. So we would learn about a certain pathway or a certain system in the body, and I would say, oh, that's why low carb does what it does. That's why insulin does this. So it kind of reinforced what I already knew and that, of course, deepened my understanding. But what is so funny to me is that I had classmates that were vegetarians and vegans, and we could learn the exact same science and come away with such different interpretations of it.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it definitely was to your advantage to have that experience beforehand. You learned so much more and so much deeper.
I think so.
And I think it's really interesting that you said you can admit it didn't stick the first time, almost like sheepishly, like, you're not perfect. And that's such a big part of your message, right? We're not perfect. We don't have to be perfect. We start and stop. So I think that experience really helped you now help your clients. So tell us some of the challenges you see when you're getting people started on a low-carb diet. So people out there can sort of say, okay, yeah, I experienced this, and this is, I'm not alone. This is how I can get over it. What are some of the things that prevent people from sticking with a low-carb diet?
Oh, man, where to start?
Yeah.
One of the big things is, and this is something that I should have said earlier, when I was new, very late 90s, early 2000s, there was so much less information about low-carb and keto. But because there was less information, there was less misinformation, there was less confusion, there were fewer conflicting messages. I've always said, I don't envy the people that are new now, because when I started, there were literally 2 books. There was the Atkins book and there was Protein Power. There was one forum. When I was new to this, Facebook did not exist, Reddit, Twitter, Instagram did not exist. So there was none of this. You just read the Atkins book, you followed the plan as written, and it was great. Yeah. Maybe you had to tweak it a little bit for yourself, for individuals, but that was a really good starting point for most people. One of the biggest challenges I see now with people is that they are so overwhelmed, not just by conflicting messages, but by information in general. Well, what about fasting and MCT oil and exogenous ketones? And do I have to do this? And what about... Let's just start with keeping the carbs really, really low. Let's do that first. They're so overwhelmed, and I don't know. Somebody must be making money off of trying to make it complicated, trying to make you need products, you need to weigh and measure everything, you need to track. How is it that Atkins wrote his first book over 40 years ago, before the internet even existed, and people did fine. They didn't have to track. They didn't have to have an app to tell them when to eat or when to stop eating or how much to eat.
They weren't testing ketones. They weren't charting everything they ate.
That's one of the bigger things I see now. And then, there's just the typical stuff that it's hard to change your diet, especially we live in such a carb-centric culture. Carbs are everywhere and they're cheap. Like I just flew here to Salt Lake City, and you can have keto options at the airport. They sell cheese, they sell hard-boiled eggs, they sell beef jerky. It's 10 times as expensive as the cookies and donuts, which aren't cheap at the airport to begin with. But part of it, a lot of it's the psychology. Well, I travel, so keto's hard for me, or, my life is this, so keto's hard. And keto's not hard at all in any of those situations. I think people just need a little bit of education as to how to do it. It's really easy when you know what to do. It might mean cooking in advance and taking food with you, knowing what to order in a restaurant if you're on the road. It's very simple. It's just so different from what people are used to.
Right. And that's your series that you're doing, Keto Without the Crazy. I love that name. Because people can get a little crazy. And yes, there's a place for tracking your macros and tracking everything you eat. And yes, there's a place for checking your ketones. But then there's also a place of saying, let's make this more simplistic.
다이어트를 할 때 각종 수치에 예민해지고 세세하게 영양소를 계산하는 건 자연스러운 일입니다. 하지만 그렇게 한다고 해서 다이어트 효과가 반드시 더 좋아지는 것은 아닙니다. 정작 우리의 신체는 영양소를 수치로 계산해가며 반응하지 않기 때문입니다. 예를 들어 단백질을 100g 이상 먹어야만 비로소 우리 몸이 근육을 만들기 시작한다거나 탄수화물을 반드시 100g 이하로 먹어야만 체지방이 연소되거나 하지 않는다는 거죠. 이런 집착은 때때로 식단을 지속하기 어렵게 만들기도 합니다. 살다 보면 나의 의지와 상관없이 외식을 해야 하거나 가족, 친구들과의 모임이 생기기도 하는데요. 계획이 없던 음식을 먹는 것에 죄책감이 들기도 하고 눈치 보며 음식을 가려 먹기도 하고 그런 게 싫어서 모임 자체를 피하기도 합니다. 다이어트를 해보신 분들이라면 이런 스트레스를 한 번쯤 겪어보신 적이 있을 겁니다. 또한 우리의 체중은 다양한 요인에 의해 변화합니다. 즉, 어제보다 몸무게가 1kg 늘었다고 해서 그것이 꼭 체지방이 증가했다는 뜻은 아니라는 겁니다. 하지만 체중계의 숫자에 집착하면 어제 분명히 운동도 열심히 하고 식단도 똑바로 했는데 왜 그러지? 내가 뭘 잘못하고 있나? 이렇게 불안해집니다. 따라서 다이어트를 할 때는 특정 숫자에 얽매이기보다는 식단의 큰 방향성을 잡고 꾸준히 실천할 수 있는 식습관을 만들어가는 것이 더 중요합니다. 그런 접근이 다양한 상황 속에서 스트레스 없이 유연하게 대처할 수 있도록 도와주고 장기적으로는 다이어트 성공 가능성을 높여줄 것입니다.
So what are some other tips you use to help people just make this simpler, make it
Yeah. I don't want to totally badmouth the tracking because there is a place for that. Especially if you think you're doing everything right and you're not getting the results you want, maybe you're not quite where you thought you were. Start chat, maybe you're eating 100 more grams of carbs than you thought or whatever. So those things can be helpful. But when people are brand new, I think it can be prohibitively complicated.
Right.
So, in terms of keeping it simple, I really try to just remind people that the single most important and most powerful, most effective aspect of this way of eating is controlling the carbs because of controlling insulin. Everything else is kind of not secondary in that it doesn't matter, but what gets you the biggest bang for your buck really is keeping the carbs low. Over time, once you've adjusted to fat burning, then maybe you want to look at the sources of your fat, whether it's, animal fat and saturated fat versus the vegetable and seed oils. Figuring out maybe you have a sensitivity to dairy or something else that you didn't realize, and maybe that's affecting you in some way. But keeping it simple is really just about the total carbs that you're eating. And, unfortunately for a lot of people, that means, if you're really having a hard time with fat loss, a lot of the really delicious sort of treats are kind of off limits. Not that they can't work, but some people get into trouble with that. And I think keeping it simple is meat and vegetables. Maybe some nuts, maybe some cheese, but all this other... I look at these keto cookbooks and they're delicious. And we're so lucky to have these creative food bloggers. But I think some people can get into trouble with the keto muffins and keto brownies. And it's...
Yes, let's talk about that. I mean, there's so many keto products on the market now, keto cookies, and trying to replace the things that we had to quote unquote give up.
Right.
And the fat bombs and the bulletproof coffees and the keto desserts. And, when someone gets started, sort of that's what they're looking for. They want to replace all these things. And I don't know. Sometimes it seems like that's more dangerous than helpful. And it sounds like you might agree with that in many situations.
Yeah, I think for some people, it's a really good bridge. It's a really good way to get you over the hump, get yourself adjusted. But I also think in some people, it perpetuates the desire for something sweet, even if it's fake sweet or, with sugar alcohols. And I'm not against these products. I think they really do have a place. If having a keto cookie or a keto brownie is going to mean the difference between someone sticking to keto in general versus not, then have it. By all means, do it.
Yeah.
But I also think, something that we don't talk about enough in this community is food addiction and binge eating and really serious psychological and physical problems with food that people have. And I think it doesn't really do you any good to replace a sugar binge addiction with an erythritol binge addiction or, for a lot of people, going keto reverses that. They find the sugar cravings are gone, the desire to binge is gone, because keto just regulates appetite so well. And there's been people who say, for the first time in my life, I'm not hungry. Mm-hmm. For the first time in my life, I can go from one meal to the next without fantasizing about food or what my next meal is going to be. But that doesn't happen for everybody. And I think these sorts of products feed into that. For some people, I think really you just have to know how you're wired because some people can do fine with them and some cannot.
Right.
우리나라의 키토제닉 커뮤니티에서도 밀가루 대신 아몬드 가루를 쓰거나 설탕 대신 알룰로스 같은 대체 감미료를 사용하는 키토베이킹을 어렵지 않게 볼 수 있습니다. 또 건강한 식단에 대한 관심이 높아지면서 식품업계에서는 당을 멀리하는 사람들을 위해 제로 아이스크림이나 제로음료 등 다양한 저당 제품들을 선보이고 있죠. 저는 이런 흐름 역시 특정 숫자에 대한 과도한 집착이 만들어낸 폐해라고 생각합니다. 단지 당 함량이 제로라고 해서 그것이 무조건 키토제닉에 적합하고 좋은 음식이라고 할 수는 없습니다. 오히려 아몬드 가루로 만든 빵이나 제로 슈거 제품을 안심하고 많이 먹거나 자주 섭취한다면 설탕을 먹는 것보다도 더 나쁜 영향을 줄 수도 있습니다. 그럼 이런 음식을 절대 먹지 말라는 거냐? 라고 물으신다면 그건 아닙니다. 많은 사람들이 식단에 대해 단순히 된다 안 된다로 명쾌한 답을 원하시지만 이 문제는 그렇게 간단히 답할 수 있는 문제가 아닙니다. 다이어트를 할 때 특정 수치를 보고 무조건 금기시하는 것 또한 바람직하지 않다고 생각합니다. 음식에 대한 갈망을 무리하게 억누르기만 하다 보면 결국 더 안 좋은 방향으로 폭발할 수 있기 때문입니다. 저는 음식 자체를 허용하거나 금지하기보다는 그 음식의 섭취량이나 먹는 빈도를 조절하는 것이 더 현명한 접근이라고 생각합니다. 이렇게 하면 특정 음식에 대한 집착에서 벗어나 그것과의 관계를 새롭게 재정립할 기회를 가질 수 있습니다. 예를 들어 저는 기름에 튀긴 바삭한 후라이드 치킨을 정말 좋아하는데요. 키토제닉 기준에는 맞지 않는 음식이지만 저는 치킨을 완전히 끊지는 않았습니다. 그 대신 닭다리살을 구입해 직접 조리해 먹거나 구운 닭으로 대체하는 방법으로 튀긴 치킨을 먹는 빈도수를 줄였습니다. 이렇듯 다이어트는 단순히 무언가를 끊고 참는 것이 아니라 나와 음식 간의 관계를 다시 만들어가는 과정이라고 생각합니다. 식생활은 좋든 싫든 매일의 일상에서 평생 지속되는 부분이기 때문에 무작정 참고 끊고 하는 고행의 과정이 되어서는 안 됩니다.
Right, and thus the common phrase we hear in the low carb world, just eat when you're hungry and stop when you're not. And for a lot of people that works, but you can imagine for the people who that